So let's crack on with this. This is what Lincoln says. We are led to reconstruct a myth in which an Indo-European hero whose name was Trito, third, this is the third created being after man and twin, suffered at the hands of a monstrous figure, a three-headed serpent, who was explicitly identified with the Aboriginals of the area in which the myth was told. In the first encounter, this serpent stole some cattle belonging to the hero or to someone close to him, but in a second meeting, when according to the Indo-Iranian version, the hero was aided by a warrior god and fortified by an intoxicating drink, he defeated the monster and recovered the cattle. Basically, the three-headed serpent steals the land or the cows or sometimes the women of the Indo-European peoples, and then the hero goes out, fights the monster, normally with the aid of soma, which is the magical drink, kills the dragon and saves the princess or the cows. Very basic dragon slaying myth. Think St. George. And Lincoln argues that this is an imperialistic myth that is sort of empire building on behalf of the Indo-European heroes who want to go out, seize the land, the women, the cows of neighboring cultures, and use this myth to justify it and demonize their enemies as mythological serpent-headed monsters. He says, the myth with which we will be dealing is one which has long been familiar to scholars. In truth, it combines two of the best-known mythic themes, that of slaying a serpent or monster and that of stealing a neighbour's cattle. The form is almost universal in its dispersion, being seen in such well-known versions as the stories of Beowulf and Grendel, Marduk and Tiamat, Ray and Apophis. But as we saw earlier, the Marduk and Tiamat myth is actually a creation myth. So maybe this myth is slightly more cosmic in origins than Lincoln suggests. He says that the Indo-European Trito myth contains two major elements. It's simultaneously the myth of the slaying of a monster and the myth of the first cattle raid. And he goes on to say how the serpentine form of the enemy is to do with a denigration of the uncivilized, non-European, non-Aryan aboriginals of the land that the Indo-Europeans want to take over. It's the same kind of process that leads the Nazis to characterize Jews as rats or vermin. It's if you animalize your enemy, it's easier then to destroy them or to take their property. So he's really looking at this myth as a very ancient form of something that still continues in certain political modern situations, unfortunately. But the main Greek version of this myth is Heracles fighting the three-headed Geryon and rescuing the cows that he has stolen. But there's a number of different versions. The Irish Toyn, which means cattle raid, Toyn Bo Cooley, the cattle raid of Cooley, is probably the other most famous version. And on a 3rd century AD drinking horn from Galahus in Denmark, we see the figure of the hero there on the left with his bow and arrow, and the three-headed monster with the cows underneath him. So this is Trito on the left, apparently, killing the three-headed demon and rescuing the cows. But again, we can argue that this isn't a political myth. It may have been turned into one. It may have become twisted to justify these kinds of acts. But originally, the myth is cosmogonic. It's a creative act. Brenneman, in an essay he wrote on serpents, cows, and ladies in the history of religions, puts this quite succinctly. He says it's based on a seasonal ritual of renewal. He said it reflects a seasonal cycle of death and rebirth of the land and of the Tuath. That's the Irish political unit identified with the land or place in which they dwell in, tribe. In the case of the cattle raid, king and queen are represented by the hero and his cattle. In some myths, the cows are in possession of a lady, thus a symbolic equation is established between cattle, queen, and cow lady. The lady and the cows are one. When the cows are stolen, symbolic death of the land ensues. When they are recovered, rebirth occurs. We see similar myths in the Hindu and in the Egyptian versions, where the sun is the cow goddess, and she disappears and then is rescued by normally a male divinity like Shu. So there's the rescue of the sun, and this starts the new day. And it also is the creation at the beginning of time when the sun is rescued from the underworld. So it's cosmic. It's a seasonal and daily cycle of death and rebirth. It's not to do originally to do with stealing cattle from your neighbour. It's been perverted to that later in time, but Lincoln is I think wrong to argue that it has its origins as a cattle stealing myth. It is a seasonal ritual. This is one of the hymns of the Rig Veda, and it talks of this dragon slaying and the freeing of the cattle and the freeing of waters. Let me sing of the heroic deeds of Indra, the first that the thunderbolt wielder performed. He killed the dragon and placed an opening for the waters. He split open the bellies of mountains. This is the Marduk and Tiamat image that we saw earlier. He killed the dragon who lay on the mountain. Tavasta fashioned the roaring thunderbolt for him. Like lowing cows, the flowing waters rush straight down into the sea. It's the creation, the division of the waters. And if we go to the last verse, the vital energy of Vritra, this is the enemy, the serpent. The vital energy of Vritra's mother ebbed away, for Indra had hurled his deadly weapon at her. Above was the mother, below was the son. Danu, this is the name of the mother, same as the Irish, lay down like a cow with her calf. So it's the original unity which is split apart. It's cosmic, it's seasonal, it's not to do with gaining territory. So if we see it as cosmic, we can start to try and look at the imagery and see whether we can find out what exactly it's pointing to. If the dragon is the Milky Way, for instance, the goddess is the Milky Way, or in Egyptian, the eye of Ra, the sun, is the goddess, the cow goddess. It's explicitly linked in Egyptian myth. The sun is the eye of the cow goddess. Then we can start to perhaps date the origin of the myth, and I'll show you how we do that. Okay, this is a quote from a PhD. This is a cosmogonic myth, yet also cyclical, for it mimics the daily ebb and flow of light and the yearly ebb and flow of fertility. The myth of the gods overcoming demons can thus be read as a victory of the active creative element over the restrictive stasis from which it emerges. The titanic creative forces at the start of creation, forces that only become regarded as negative in the daily and yearly cycles when the year slips back into unproductive stasis and chaos, night or winter, necessitating a reenactment of the creative act to recreate the cosmos. In other words, the forces sort of present in the world that have been rent from chaos to form the cosmos. At the end of the day or the end of the year, there's a reversion to chaos, and this is seen as negative, the dragon swallowing the sun. And so the creative act must happen again, and the two must be torn apart. So the dragon must be killed again, daily or yearly. So this is shown most clearly in later Egyptian imagery from the New Kingdom, where the sun at the end of the day, of each day, enters the mouth of Nut and is born from her womb each morning. The gestation period involves a combat within her as the sun god battles the monsters of the night through 12 stellar regions of the underworld, ending with the final victory of the sun over the chaos serpent Apophis. So this myth of the release of water or light from the confines of the cave, from the original chaos, this is from the monster. It's a very old and widespread myth. Witzel, American scholar Witzel, in his book The Origins of World Mythologies, it's a brilliant book, states that this myth belongs to one of the stages after the emergence of heaven and earth, and it forms part of the cosmogony. The myth relates to the disappearance of the sun or the deity of the sun in a cave or some other enclosure, and its reappearance, often as dawn, after the intervention of a group of gods and others, creating or restoring light and prosperity to the world. He relates how in the Vedas, the Rig Veda, the light of dawn, Ushas, is regarded as a beautiful young woman hidden in a cave on an island in the middle of the celestial river Rasha. Now this is the Milky Way, accompanied by poets and singers. These poets make a din outside the cave, and Indra smashes the lock with his lightning bolt to release the dawn. The release of Ushas, Witzel states, brings with it not only life, but also riches in the form of cattle, the reddish cows. These are identified with the reddish dawn and with ritual poetry, which in the Rigvedic conception, and my picture's in the world in the way of the word there, so I can't see what it says. Create the world together, perhaps. And the idea is that the cow, the sun, are released at dawn through the instigation of this heroic dragon-slaying figure. The main version he mentions is a Japanese version, which probably got its Indo-European source through sort of Hindu influence with the spread of Buddhism from India. So in the Japanese myth, we have the sun goddess Amaterasu, and she hides in a cave after being insulted by her brother. And because the sun is hidden away in the cave, winter comes, the land becomes barren, and the gods have to try and find a way to trick the sun back out of the cave. And they do this by getting a goddess called Azume to dance erotically, and it makes the gods laugh. And Amaterasu, the sun goddess who's hiding, hears them laughing, and so pokes her head out the cave to see what's going on, and they grab her and slam the door behind her. So that sort of saves the cosmos, and the sun is born again, thanks to this sort of joke and this dancing goddess. Now, I'll go into this in the last lecture when I identified this dancing goddess, Azumi, which means whirling heavenly woman with the Milky Way. And I will then say why it is that she does this erotic dance and what it means astronomically. And here's Azume dancing and Amaterasu coming out of the cave. This is at the solstice. and it's the winter solstice, and it's the rebirth of the sun in the winter. Now, the same image appears in Greek myth, in the myth of Demeter and Persephone. Persephone is abducted into the underworld, which causes the loss of spring and loss of fertility to the land. Her mother Demeter goes looking for her, and when she reaches Eleusis, a woman called Balbo dances before her lewdly, as we can see on the left. This causes Demeter to laugh, and it's instrumental in the rescuing of Persephone somehow. The same thing happens in Egyptian myth, where the sun god Ra is moribund, his health is failing, and then the goddess Hathor dances for him erotically, and this stirs him back to life. Now, when we look at other Indo-European myths, we see quite often this rescue of the sun goddess. The sun in Proto-Indo-European seems to have been a goddess, female figure, and she is often rescued by, this is from Bronze Age Denmark, we see these two axe-bearing figures. These are twins who are rescuing her. That's a later concept where it's the rescue of the sun by the morning and evening stars. It's an astronomical image, and it's to do with Venus rising above the sun and setting with the sun. So we're seeing here the start of an astronomical interpretation, but originally the rescuing figure is one figure, one hero, and he strides across the horizon, and he, with his thunderbolt or his sword or his axe, and he leads the sun goddess out of the underworld. So who might he be, and what might the implications be for the dating of this myth? Well, what I've done is to associate him with Orion. Orion, you probably thought this was originally St. Christopher when you saw this, but the myth of St. Christopher crossing the river with Christ on his shoulders seems to come from an earlier myth where Orion, the constellation, carries the sun over the Milky Way. It's an astronomical myth. And here we can see Orion, the sun rising with Orion, which is something that happened at the spring equinox about 4000 BC. And here's St. Christopher here. There's a convoluted argument for this in my PhD, which I probably will go into in the last lecture, but there's not time now. Anyway, we think that this figure that rescues the goddess from the underworld, striding across the sky, is Orion, because there's an Irish myth that talks about him placing 3 stones in his belt when he's rescuing this goddess and carrying her on his shoulders. The importance of this is that there are a lot of ancient sources which identify this hero with Orion, for a start. But when I mentioned earlier about precession and the dating and of certain constellations, the rising of constellations in time, and how we could use this to date certain structures, if the myth is talking about Orion leading the sun out of the underworld, and this is associated with rebirth in the spring or at the midwinter, as it is in Japanese myth, then it allows us to date it, because the sun doesn't rise with Orion now in the spring. So the question is, when did it arise? This allows us to reconstruct when this myth may have originated and where it may have originated. So here is Orion rising with the sun. Obviously, you can't see Orion, but if you know when the sun is rising with it, but there are occasions when he'll rise with the moon, and you can see the moon in his hand. But it doesn't matter that we can't see him. To the ancient world, to the ancient minds, the rising of the sun with the constellation, even though it's not visible, is the important point. So, for instance, those of you who are into astrology know that, I'm, for instance, I'm a Taurus because I was born in May. That is when the sun is rising with Taurus. But you can never see the sun rising with Taurus, but that doesn't invalidate the fact that I'm a Taurus and the sun is in the house of the bull. That is the important point. The sun is rising in this instance with Orion. But this is the origin of the St. Christopher image, or the Orion image of the child on the shoulders or being held in the hand. But there's an earlier image, which is Orion leading the other figure, leading the cows out of the underworld. And this is an even earlier image. What this astronomical interpretation allows us also to do is to identify the three-headed serpent, not as an aboriginal of the land that the Indo-European people wanted to take, but as a constellation, because the constellation of Scorpio stands exactly opposite in the sky from Orion. So the two are in kind of seesawing motion. And the sun sort of occupies, it goes towards the sun, towards Scorpius the winter half of the year, and then back towards Orion in the summer. So if the sun represents, power, fertility, the cows, the goddess, then these are taken by the serpent, the three-headed serpent. You can see originally Scorpius in Indo-European myth, we think, would have been a three-headed being, three-headed serpent. There's a couple of Latin sources that talk about Scorpius as serpens. So we have Orion and Scorpio fighting over the sun. So the sun wishes the cattle, comes back eventually to Orion, to the hands of Orion. And this is the myth, the dragon, the St. George myth. It's rescuing from the three-headed dragon, three-headed serpent, the power of the sun. So when did it arise? If Lincoln is right about this myth, and it's just a sort of political myth, then it doesn't matter when it arose. But if it's an astronomical myth, which is what I argue, then the myth can't really be much earlier than about 10,000 BC, because Orion wasn't visible in the night sky anywhere north of Cairo before about 10,500 BC. At this point, in about 10,500 BC, I'll go on to this one. I'm not sure how to go back. Basically, the Orion leading the sun out of the underworld is a myth that at midwinter could have arisen in about 10,500 BC. In about 7,500 BC, from Anatolia, from the Near East, he could be seen leading the sun out of the underworld at the spring equinox, whereas he carries the sun due to precession about 3,000 years later in 4,500 BC. So we can see the development of this myth over time, from leading the sun to carrying the sun. And the myth seems to suggest that if it's a midwinter or a spring mythology, then there's a chance it could have arisen as early as 10,500 BC if you were somewhere as south as Cairo. And so if you're in ancient Egypt, pre-dynastic Egypt, the myth could have originated then. The more likely or possible is that the myth of Orion leading the sun out of the underworld from the hands of the dragon, occurred around the spring equinox in the Near East, about 7,500 years before Christ. At the latest, the idea of Orion carrying at the spring equinox, at the latest, we're talking 4,500 BC. Any later than this, the correlation doesn't work. The sun starts to rise before Orion. It'll start to rise with other constellations, and the myth fails to make sense. So the fact that we have the myth of the man with 3 stones in his belt leading the son from the goddess from out of the underworld suggests that this myth developed somewhere between 7,500 and 4,500 BC, probably in the Near East. So that in this case, the form of the myth helps us suggest a date. And if we look at the Galahus drinking horn, we could see it perhaps as the night sky with Scorpio on the right-hand side and Orion on the left. And Orion has 3 stars above it, probably decorative, but I like to think that it's referencing him with his 3 belt stars, but that's me being fanciful, probably. So in summary, the image of the rescue of the sun on the shoulders of or being led by Orion is arguably either a midwinter or a spring equinox myth, as these are the times that the sun is reborn. As the myth is astronomically derived, its origin can not only be pinpointed in time, but also to a geographical location. The sun does not rise with Orion on either date as viewed from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, 3,500 BC, the posited place and time of origin of the Proto-Indo-European culture. At the spring equinox, at that location, it rises nearly 2 hours before Orion, and at the winter solstice, over 5 hours before. Instead, Orion rises with the sun early to mid-May, by which time spring is well underway at that latitude. To find Orion rising with the sun in the spring, first leading, then carrying the sun, we need to go further back in time, to between 8,500 to 4,500 BC, although an earlier midwinter correlation does exist for 10,500 BC. The myth of Orion as rescuer then only makes sense if it originated from either 10,500 BC, from the South Levant or Egypt, or from around 8,500, 7,500, initially only visible from southern Anatolia southwards, but moving progressively north through this period, and it is unlikely to have arisen after 4,500 BC. So it is unlikely to have arisen during the time that the Proto-Indo-European cultures are said to have been formed on the Pontic-Caspian steppes north of the Black Sea. So we can say that this myth, this Proto-Indo-European myth, predates the Proto-Indo-European peoples as thought of by current scholars by 1,000 years at least, if not 3,000, even 7,000 years. So it goes to show that the myths suggest an earlier origin for certain elements of these cultures. And in the next lecture, we will look at the possible spread of Neolithic goddess images from the Near East through the with the spread of farming in the Neolithic to Neolithic Europe around 4000 BC, as evidence of the spread of this sky goddess. Cheers.